October 5th, 6:47. The fog rolled in like a burial shroud across the Susquehanna River Valley, its ghostly fingers clawing through the maple trees that lined Millbrook Falls Main Street. The temperature had dropped to 38 degrees overnight, and the first frost of the season painted the windows of the small Pennsylvania town with intricate patterns that resembled spider webs, an omen that would prove more prophetic than anyone could have imagined. Sheriff Clayton Murdoch stood on the steps of the Millbrook Falls Police Department, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning air as he watched the mist swirl around the white steeple of Sacred Heart Presbyterian Church. The building seemed to emerge from the fog like a phantom ship, its Gothic architecture casting long shadows across the empty street. Something felt wrong this morning, a tension that settled in his bones like arthritis before a storm. At 43, Murdoch had been sheriff of this quiet farming community for nearly a decade. He'd seen his share of domestic disputes, drunk and disorderly calls, and the occasional theft of farm equipment. But Millbrook Falls wasn't the kind of place where people simply vanished into thin air. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where secrets were as rare as locked doors, and where the most exciting event of the year was the annual Harvest Festival. That morning, however, would mark the beginning of a mystery that would haunt the town for 25 years. The call came at 7. Sheriff's office, Murdoch answered, settling behind his desk with a cup of black coffee that had already gone cold. Sheriff Murdoch. The voice belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, the church secretary whose nervous disposition was legendary throughout the county. "I'm calling about Pastor Kendrick. He didn't show up for the early service preparation." Murdoch frowned, glancing at the calendar on his desk. "What time was he supposed to be there, Eleanor?" 6:30, same as every Saturday morning for the past 8 years. Her voice trembled with barely contained anxiety. "He's never been late, not once. And his car isn't in the parking lot, but..." She paused, her breathing audible through the receiver. "Sheriff, his office light was on when I arrived and the door was unlocked." The coffee cup froze halfway to Murdoch's lips. Pastor Thaddeus Kendrick was nothing if not methodical. The 45-year-old minister had been the spiritual cornerstone of Millbrook Falls since 1969, known for his punctuality, his compassion, and his unwavering dedication to his congregation of 300 souls. If Kendrick said he'd be somewhere at 6:30, he was there at 6:25, Bible in hand and prayer on his lips. "I will be right over," Murdoch said, already reaching for his jacket. The drive to Sacred Heart Presbyterian took less than 3 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. The fog seemed to thicken with each passing moment, reducing visibility to mere yards. As Murdoch pulled into the church parking lot, his headlights swept across the empty asphalt, where Pastor Kendrick's bronze 1974 Buick Skylark should have been parked. Eleanor Whitmore waited by the church's main entrance, her gray hair pulled back in its customary bun, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. At 62, she had been the church secretary for over 2 decades, and Murdoch had never seen her this agitated. "Show me his office," he said without preamble. They walked through the sanctuary, their footsteps echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The stained glass windows depicting scenes from the Bible cast multicolored shadows across the empty pews. The morning light filtering through the fog created an otherworldly atmosphere, as if they were walking through a cathedral underwater. Pastor Kendrick's office was located behind the altar, accessible through a narrow hallway, lined with photographs of church events dating back to the building's construction in 1923. The door stood ajar, just as Eleanor had described, and warm light spilled out into the darkened corridor. Murdoch pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The office was immaculate, as always. Books lined the shelves in perfect order, theology texts, commentaries, and pastoral care guides. Kendrick's desk sat beneath a window that looked out onto the church cemetery, its surface organized with the precision of a military inspection. A half-finished sermon lay on the blotter, the pastor's distinctive handwriting flowing across the yellow legal pad, in neat, measured lines. But it was what Murdoch found on top of the sermon that made his blood run cold. A single black feather, approximately 6 inches long, lay across the handwritten text. It wasn't from any bird native to Pennsylvania, too large for a crow, too dark for a hawk. The feather seemed to absorb the light around it, creating a void in the otherwise bright office. "Was this here when you arrived?" Murdoch asked, pointing to the feather. Eleanor shook her head, her face pale. "No, Sheriff. I don't know where that came from. I have never seen anything like it." Murdoch carefully lifted the feather using a handkerchief, noting its unusual weight and the way it seemed to shimmer with an oily iridescence. Beneath it, he could read the last words Pastor Kendrick had written. "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world." The verse from Ephesians 6:12 trailed off mid-sentence, as if Kendrick had been interrupted while writing. "Eleanor, I need you to think carefully," Murdoch said, his voice steady despite the unease growing in his chest. "When was the last time you saw Pastor Kendrick?" "Yesterday evening," she replied without hesitation. "Around 7 o'clock. I stayed late to finish the bulletin for Sunday service. He was in his office, working on tomorrow's sermon. He seemed troubled." "Troubled how?" Eleanor wrung her hands, her eyes darting around the office as if searching for answers in the familiar surroundings. He'd been receiving some strange mail over the past few weeks, letters without return addresses. He wouldn't tell me what they said, but they upset him greatly. Yesterday, when I brought him his afternoon coffee, I found him reading one of those letters. His hands were shaking. Murdoch felt the first stirrings of genuine concern. "Do you know what happened to these letters?" "He burned them," Eleanor whispered. "Right there in the fireplace. Every single one." "But Sheriff," she paused, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Before he burned the last one yesterday, I saw part of it, just a glimpse as he was folding it." "What did you see?" "A drawing, crude, like something a child might make. It was a tree, but not a normal tree. The branches were twisted, and there were symbols carved into the trunk. And beneath it," she shuddered, "beneath it were what looked like bodies, people buried under the roots." The temperature in the office seemed to drop 10 degrees. Murdoch found himself glancing toward the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like grasping fingers. In the distance, barely visible through the mist, stood the massive oak tree that had given the town its name, Millbrook Oak, a centuries-old giant that dominated the town square. "Has anyone else been acting strangely lately?" Murdoch asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Eleanor nodded grimly. "The Brennan family stopped coming to church 3 weeks ago. When I called to check on them, Margaret Brennan said they were taking a spiritual sabbatical." But her voice, she sounded terrified. "Sheriff." Like someone was making her say those words. Murdoch made a mental note to visit the Brennan farm later that day. "Anyone else?" "Young Timothy Marsh," Eleanor continued. "He's been having nightmares. His mother brought him to see Pastor Kendrick last week. The boy kept talking about the man in the shadows who visited him in his dreams. He said this man promised to show him where the bad pastor was hiding." The pieces of a puzzle were beginning to form, though the picture they created was one that defied rational explanation. Murdoch had lived in Millbrook Falls his entire life, had grown up listening to the old-timers' stories about the town's history. There were tales that went back to the colonial era, whispers of things that happened in the woods surrounding the town, stories that most people dismissed as folklore. But standing in Pastor Kendrick's empty office, holding a feather that shouldn't exist, Murdoch found himself remembering those stories with uncomfortable clarity. The history of Millbrook Falls was steeped in tragedy. Founded in 1754 by German settlers, the town had prospered until the harsh winter of 1763, when nearly half the population mysteriously disappeared. The survivors spoke of a darkness that had settled over the community, of nightmares that came to life of a malevolent presence that dwelt beneath the ancient oak tree. Those who remained had rebuilt the town, but they'd also established certain traditions, protective measures. Some called them Sacred Heart Presbyterian, had been built on the site of the original Lutheran church, which had burned under mysterious circumstances in The new church faced east, toward the rising sun, with its back deliberately turned on the oak tree. Iron crosses were embedded in the foundation, and the cemetery was surrounded by a fence of blessed iron posts. For over 2 centuries, these precautions had seemed to work. The town had remained peaceful, prosperous, and free from the supernatural incidents that had plagued it in its early years. Until now. "Sheriff?" Eleanor's voice pulled him from his dark reverie. "What do we do? The congregation will start arriving for evening service in a few hours. What do I tell them?" Murdoch pocketed the black feather and turned toward the door. "Tell them Pastor Kendrick was called away on urgent family business. I will handle the rest." But as they left the office and walked back through the sanctuary, Murdoch caught sight of something that made his steps falter. In the corner of his eye, he thought he saw a figure standing among the pews, tall, dressed in black, with eyes that gleamed like coal in the dim light. When he turned to look directly, however, there was nothing there but empty wooden benches and dancing shadows. The investigation began in earnest that afternoon. Murdoch called in favors from neighboring counties, bringing in search dogs and additional officers to help comb through the woods surrounding Millbrook Falls. Pastor Kendrick's bronze Buick Skylark was found 3 miles outside of town, abandoned on a logging road that led deep into the Pennsylvania wilderness. The car's condition was puzzling. The doors were unlocked, the keys still in the ignition, but there were no signs of struggle or violence. Kendrick's wallet remained in the glove compartment, containing $63 and all of his identification. His Bible sat on the passenger seat, open to the book of Revelation, chapter 20. What disturbed Murdoch most, however, were the footprints in the soft earth around the vehicle. Pastor Kendrick's size 11 shoes led away from the car and into the woods, but they weren't alone. Alongside them was a second set of prints, bare feet, unnaturally large, with what appeared to be claw marks at the toe. The search teams followed the trail for half a mile before it simply vanished. One moment, the tracks were clear and deep in the forest floor. The next, they were gone, as if both Pastor Kendrick and his mysterious companion had simply been lifted into the air. "This doesn't make sense," muttered Detective Ray Kowalski from the state police, crouching beside the last clear footprint. "People don't just disappear into thin air." But Murdoch was beginning to suspect that in Millbrook Falls, the impossible might be disturbingly common. As darkness fell on October 15, 1977, the search was called off for the night. The volunteers and law enforcement officers returned to town with empty hands and haunted expressions. They had found no trace of Pastor Thaddeus Kendrick beyond those inexplicable footprints and his abandoned car. Murdoch sat in his office long into the night, staring at the black feather he'd found in the pastor's office. Outside, the fog had lifted, revealing a clear sky filled with stars that seemed unusually bright. But their light felt cold and distant, offering no comfort to the worried sheriff. At 2:47 a.m., his phone rang. "Sheriff's office," he answered, though his voice was hoarse from exhaustion. "Sheriff Murdoch?" The voice was barely a whisper, so faint he could hardly make out the words. This is Pastor Kendrick." Murdoch shot upright in his chair, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Pastor? Where are you? Are you all right?" The line crackled with static, and when the voice came again, it seemed to emanate from somewhere impossibly far away. I'm in the dark place, Sheriff. The place beneath the roots. I can see, oh God, I can see what they have been hiding. All these years we thought we were safe, but we were wrong. The tree remembers everything. Pastor, stay calm. Tell me where you are, and we will come get you. A sound came through the phone that Murdoch would never forget, a laugh that was equal parts terror and despair. You can't come here, Sheriff. No living soul can walk in this place. But you need to know. You need to warn them. The congregation, the town, everyone needs to know what's coming. What's coming? Pastor, you are not making sense. October 31st. Kendrick's voice was growing fainter, as if he were being pulled away from the phone. All Hallows Eve. That's when the barrier is thinnest. That's when he can cross over fully. The man in black, the one who's been sending the letters, the one who's been visiting the children in their dreams, he's not a man at all. The line went dead. Murdoch stared at the phone for several long moments, his mind reeling. He called the telephone company immediately, but they could find no record of any incoming call to his office that night. According to their logs, his phone hadn't rung once between 6 p.m., but Murdoch knew what he'd heard. Pastor Kendrick was alive, or something that claimed to be Pastor Kendrick was alive somewhere in a place he described as beneath the roots. And whatever had taken him was planning something for Halloween night, just 16 days away. As dawn broke over Millbrook Falls on October 16th, Sheriff Clayton Murdoch made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would find Pastor Thaddeus Kendrick, no matter what it cost him. He would uncover the truth about the mysterious letters, the strange disappearances, and the malevolent presence that seemed to be awakening in his peaceful town. But as he stood on the steps of the police station, watching the morning sun struggle to penetrate the persistent fog that had settled over Millbrook Falls like a curse, Murdoch couldn't shake the feeling that he was already too late. The darkness that the town's founders had tried so desperately to contain was stirring, and when it finally broke free, it would consume everything in its path. The black feather in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour, and in the distance the ancient oak tree swayed in a wind that no one else could feel, its massive trunk scarred with symbols that predated human memory, symbols that were beginning to glow with an otherworldly light as October 31st drew inexorably closer. Pastor Thaddeus Kendrick had vanished without a trace, but his disappearance was only the beginning. Something far more sinister was awakening in Millbrook Falls, something that had been waiting patiently beneath the earth for over 2 centuries, biding its time until the stars aligned and the barriers between worlds grew thin enough to cross. The shepherd was lost, and the wolves were beginning to howl. October 18, 11:30. The autumn rain fell in steady sheets across Millbrook Falls, turning the unpaved roads into rivers of mud and washing away the last traces of Pastor Kendrick's footprints from the forest floor. Sheriff Clayton Murdoch stood beneath the dripping eaves of the Brennan farmhouse, his knuckles poised to knock on a door that hadn't been opened to visitors in 3 weeks. 3 days had passed since the mysterious phone call, and Murdoch had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that voice, Kendrick's voice, yet somehow not speaking of dark places beneath the roots and barriers growing thin. The Pennsylvania State Police had officially classified the pastor's disappearance as a missing person case, but Murdoch knew they were dealing with something far beyond their understanding. The Brennan farm sat on 47 acres of rolling hills, 2 miles east of town, its weathered red barn and modest white farmhouse usually bustling with activity. But as Murdoch approached the front porch, he noticed the profound silence that had settled over the property like a burial shroud. No chickens pecked in the yard, no cattle lowed in the pastures, and the windows of the house were covered with heavy curtains that blocked out even the gray daylight. His knock echoed hollowly against the wooden door. "Mrs. Brennan, this is Sheriff Murdoch. I need to speak with you about Pastor Kendrick." Long moments passed before he heard the sound of multiple locks being undone, far more locks than any farmhouse should need. The door opened just wide enough to reveal Margaret Brennan's haggard face, her usually neat brown hair hanging in unwashed strands around hollow cheeks. At 38, she had always been a vibrant woman, known throughout the county for her prize-winning apple pies and her infectious laughter. The woman who peered at him through the crack in the door bore little resemblance to that person. "Sheriff," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously over his shoulder as if expecting to see something lurking behind him. "We can't. We are not supposed to talk to anyone." "Margaret, Pastor Kendrick is missing. I know you have been having some troubles, but I need to understand what's been happening here." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, Murdoch thought she might break down entirely. "It started with the dreams," she said, her voice barely audible above the rain. "All of us, even little Sarah. The same dream, night after night." "What kind of dreams?" Margaret glanced over her shoulder into the darkened interior of the house, then stepped onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind her. "Dreams about the oak tree, about things buried beneath it, about a man in black who promises to show us secrets if we just stop going to church." The rain intensified, forcing them to huddle closer to the door. Murdoch could smell something strange on Margaret's breath, something sweet and cloying, like overripe fruit. "This man in the dreams," Murdoch pressed. "What does he look like?" "Tall, wearing a black coat that never gets wet, no matter how hard it rains. His face," she shuddered. "Sometimes he has a face, sometimes he doesn't. When he does, it's always different. Sometimes he looks like Pastor Kendrick, sometimes like my deceased father, sometimes like people I have never seen before. But his eyes are always the same, black as coal, and when you look into them, you can see things moving underneath, like worms in fresh earth." Murdoch felt the black feather in his pocket grow heavier. "When did these dreams start?" 3 weeks ago, right after we received the letter." "What letter?" Margaret looked around nervously, then reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a crumpled piece of paper. The parchment was old and yellowed, covered with symbols that hurt Murdoch's eyes to look at directly. Beneath the symbols, written in what appeared to be dried blood, were the words, "The faithful shall be rewarded. Abandon false shepherds. Embrace the true shepherd who dwells beneath the roots." "Has anyone else received letters like this?" "Half the congregation," Margaret whispered. "Maybe more. But nobody talks about it. We are all too afraid." Before Murdoch could respond, the farmhouse door creaked open behind them. A small face peered out. Sarah Brennan, Margaret's 8-year-old daughter. The little girl's once bright eyes were now dull and lifeless, surrounded by dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights and terrible dreams. "Mama," Sarah said in a voice far too mature for her years, "he's here again. The man in black. He's standing by the oak tree, and he's calling for Pastor Kendrick." Margaret grabbed her daughter and pulled her inside, but not before Murdoch caught sight of something that made his blood turn to ice. Sarah's left arm was covered with symbols carved into her skin with something sharp, the wounds still fresh and weeping. "Margaret, wait," Murdoch called out, but the door slammed shut and he heard the sounds of locks being hastily engaged. He stood alone on the porch for several long minutes, rain soaking through his uniform, staring at the letter in his hand. The symbols seemed to writhe and shift when he wasn't looking directly at them, and he could swear he heard whispers emanating from the parchment voices, speaking in a language that predated human civilization. The drive back to town took him past the Millbrook Oak, and Murdoch found himself pulling over despite every instinct screaming at him to keep driving. The ancient tree stood in the center of the town square, its massive trunk easily 20 feet in diameter, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like the arms of some primordial god. Local historians estimated its age at over 400 years, making it one of the oldest living things in Pennsylvania. But as Murdoch sat in his patrol car, engine idling, he began to notice details about the tree that he'd never seen before. Or perhaps details that hadn't been there before. The bark was covered with symbols similar to those on Margaret Brennan's letter, carved so deeply into the wood that they seemed to glow with their own inner light. The ground around the base of the tree was bare of grass, forming a perfect circle of dark earth that looked freshly turned, as if something had been digging up from below. And there, standing motionless beside the trunk, was a figure in black, tall and gaunt, wearing a coat that seemed to absorb the gray daylight. The figure faced away from Murdoch toward the church. Even through the rain and mist, Murdoch could see that the figure cast no shadow, and the rain seemed to pass through it rather than striking its surface. As if sensing his gaze, the figure slowly turned. Murdoch's hands clenched the steering wheel as he found himself staring into a face that was somehow both familiar and impossible. It was Pastor Kendrick's face, but wrong in every conceivable way. The features were too sharp, the skin too pale, and the eyes were exactly as Margaret Brennan had described, black as coal with something moving beneath the surface. The thing that wore Pastor Kendrick's face smiled, revealing teeth that were too long and too sharp to belong to any human being. It raised one hand in a gesture that might have been a greeting or a blessing, and Murdoch saw that its fingers ended in blackened claws that dripped with something dark and viscous. Then it spoke, though its lips never moved, and its voice echoed inside Murdoch's skull. "Hello, Sheriff. I have been waiting for you." Murdoch floored the accelerator, his patrol car spraying mud and gravel as he fled from the town square. In his rearview mirror, he saw the figure standing motionless beside the oak tree, still smiling its terrible smile until the rain and distance mercifully obscured it from view. Back at the police station, Murdoch locked himself in his office and spread out everything he'd collected related to Pastor Kendrick's disappearance. The black feather, the mysterious letter, photographs of the abandoned car, witness statements from the search volunteers, all of it pointed to something that existed outside the realm of natural explanation. But Murdoch had lived in Millbrook Falls his entire life, and he remembered the stories his grandfather used to tell about the town's founding. Stories that most people dismissed as folklore, but which now seemed disturbingly relevant. He walked to the station's small library and pulled out a leather-bound volume titled The History of Millbrook Falls, 754, 1950, written by local historian Professor Ezra Blackwood in Murdoch had skimmed through it years ago during a slow week, but now he read it with the intensity of a man searching for his salvation. The book confirmed what he'd remembered about the town's dark early years. The German settlers who founded Millbrook Falls had chosen the location specifically because of the ancient oak tree, which they believed possessed protective properties. But within a decade, strange incidents began occurring with increasing frequency. Livestock would be found dead in perfect circles around the tree, their blood drained but no marks on their bodies. Children reported seeing shadow people playing among the oak's roots. Most disturbing of all, several adults simply vanished without explanation, leaving behind only mysterious symbols carved into tree bark and strange dreams shared by multiple witnesses. The crisis reached its peak in the winter of 1763, when the town's first pastor, Johannes Zimmermann, disappeared during a blizzard. According to eyewitness accounts, Zimmermann had been conducting an exorcism at the base of the oak tree, attempting to banish what he believed was a malevolent entity that had taken residence beneath its roots. The last person to see Pastor Zimmermann, alive, was his assistant, Wilhelm Brennan, Margaret Brennan's ancestor, who reported that the pastor had been dragged underground by hands made of shadow and bone. The surviving townspeople found Zimmermann's Bible at the base of the tree, open to Revelation chapter 20, with a message written in the margins in what appeared to be the pastor's own blood. "It is not imprisoned. It has never been imprisoned. It has been waiting." Half the town's population fled that winter, but those who remained developed the protective measures that had kept Millbrook Falls safe for over 2 centuries. The Lutheran church was torn down and rebuilt as Sacred Heart Presbyterian, positioned to face away from the oak tree. Iron crosses were embedded in the foundation, blessed by 7 different denominations. The cemetery was surrounded by a fence of cold iron, and specific prayers were to be said at sunrise and sunset every day. Most importantly, the townspeople established a covenant. As long as the church remained strong and the faithful continued to gather, the entity beneath the oak would remain dormant. But if the congregation ever failed, if the church ever stood empty, if the protective rituals were ever abandoned, Murdoch closed the book and leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. According to Professor Blackwood's research, similar incidents had occurred roughly every 50 years since the town's founding. The disappearance of Pastor Kendrick marked exactly 214 years since Johannes Zimmerman's vanishing. The phone on his desk rang, jolting him from his dark reverie. Sheriff's office. Sheriff Murdoch. The voice belonged to Dr. Helena Voss, the town's only physician, and one of the few people in Millbrook Falls with a college education. I need you to come to my clinic immediately. I have a patient you need to see. What kind of patient? Timothy Marsh. The boy's mother brought him in an hour ago. Sheriff, I have been practicing medicine for 20 years, and I have never seen anything like this. Murdoch found Dr. Voss's clinic in a state of controlled chaos. The normally composed physician met him at the door, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled and her hands shaking as she led him toward the examination room. The boy's been unconscious for the past 6 hours, she explained in hushed tones, but he's been talking the entire time. Not random babbling coherent sentences, conversations with someone we can't see. And Sheriff, she paused at the examination room door. He's been speaking in languages that don't exist. Through the small window in the door, Murdoch could see 9-year-old Timothy Marsh lying on the examination table, his small body rigid with tension. His mother, Catherine, sat beside him, tears streaming down her face as she held his hand. As they entered the room, Timothy's eyes snapped open, though he remained perfectly still. His gaze fixed on Murdoch with an intensity that was deeply unsettling in a child so young. "Sheriff," Timothy said, his voice carrying an odd echo, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. "The pastor wants to see you. He has something very important to tell you about what's buried beneath the roots." Catherine Marsh looked up at Murdoch with desperate eyes. "He's been saying things like this all morning. About Pastor Kendrick, about the oak tree, about something that's going to happen on Halloween night." Timothy's head turned toward his mother with mechanical precision. "Mama, you need to go to the oak tree tonight. You need to bring the others. The faithful shall be rewarded, but only if they come willingly." Dr. Voss stepped forward, her medical training overriding her fear. "Timothy, I'm going to give you something to help you sleep." The boy's head snapped toward her, and when he smiled, Murdoch saw that his teeth had grown longer and sharper, just like the thing he'd seen by the oak tree. "Sleep is for the living, Dr. Voss. I am already in the place where the dreaming dead whisper their secrets." Before anyone could react, Timothy began to convulse, his small body arching off the examination table. Words poured from his mouth in a torrent, some in English, others in languages that seemed to predate human speech. But through the chaos, Murdoch caught fragments that chilled him to the bone. 7 days remain. The barrier weakens with each sunset. The faithful shall join their shepherd in the dark places. The oak remembers all who have fed its roots. Halloween night, when the veil is thinnest, the covenant shall be broken. The convulsions stopped as suddenly as they had begun. Timothy lay still for a moment, then sat up and looked around the room with the confused expression of a normal 9-year-old boy. "Mama," he said in his regular voice, "why am I in Dr. Voss's clinic? I was just playing in my room." But as Catherine Marsh pulled her son into her arms, sobbing with relief, Murdoch noticed something that made his stomach turn. Carved into Timothy's left palm, so fresh that it was still bleeding, was the same symbol he'd seen on Margaret Brennan's letter, a twisted tree with bodies buried beneath its roots. The mark of the entity beneath the oak. As darkness fell over Millbrook Falls on October 18th, Sheriff Clayton Murdoch made a decision that would either save his town or damn it forever. He would gather the remaining members of the congregation, share what he'd learned about the town's history, and prepare for the confrontation that was coming on Halloween night. But first, he needed to understand exactly what they were dealing with, and that meant returning to the oak tree, armed with knowledge and protected by faith, to face the thing that claimed to be Pastor Kendrick. 7 days remained until All Hallows Eve. 7 days until the barrier between worlds grew thin enough for something ancient and hungry to cross over permanently. 7 days to save Millbrook Falls from a darkness that had been waiting over 2 centuries for its chance to feed. The shepherd was lost, The flock was scattered, and something wearing a familiar face was calling them home to the roots of evil. Millbrook Falls, Pennsylvania, October 31st through 11. The wind howled through the streets of Millbrook Falls like the voices of the damned, carrying with it the scent of decay and something far worse, the sweet, cloying smell of corruption that seemed to seep from the very earth itself. Sheriff Clayton Murdoch stood at the edge of the town square, clutching a shotgun loaded with shells that had been blessed by Father O'Brien from the Catholic Church in neighboring Riverside. Behind him, 17 members of Sacred Heart Presbyterian's congregation huddled together, their faces pale with terror but their resolve unshaken. The past 13 days had transformed the peaceful farming community into something resembling a ghost town. Half the population had fled after the incidents began escalating, packing their belongings and leaving without explanation. Those who remained spoke in whispers and avoided the town center, where the ancient oak tree had grown larger and more twisted with each passing night. But tonight was different. Tonight, the barrier between worlds had grown thin enough to slice paper, and something that had waited over 2 centuries for this moment was finally ready to cross over permanently. The oak tree dominated the square like a malevolent cathedral, its trunk now nearly 30 feet in diameter, its branches reaching toward the star-filled sky with an obscene hunger. The symbols carved into its bark glowed with phosphorescent light, pulsing in rhythm with something that might have been a heartbeat. The ground around its base had cracked and buckled, revealing dark chasms that exhaled the stench of ancient graves. And standing beside the tree, exactly as he had every night for the past 2 weeks, was the thing that wore Pastor Kendrick's face. "Welcome, Sheriff," it called out, its voice carrying impossible distances on the wind. "Welcome, faithful servants of Sacred Heart. I have been waiting so long to show you the truth." Eleanor Whitmore stepped forward from the group, her elderly frame trembling but her voice steady. "You are not Pastor Kendrick. I have known Thaddeus for 20 years, and whatever you are not him." The creature smiled, and its face shifted like smoke, cycling through dozens of different visages, some familiar, others horrifyingly alien. "I am everyone who has ever fed the roots, dear Eleanor. I am Johannes Zimmerman, your first pastor. I am Jacob Brennan, who disappeared in. I am Sarah Morrison, taken in 1864. And yes, I am your beloved Thaddeus Kendrick, consumed willingly to spare his flock from a worse fate." Dr. Helena Voss, standing near the back of the group, with her medical bag clutched in white-knuckled hands, spoke up. "What do you want from us?" "Want?" The creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the whispers of dying children. "I want nothing, good doctor. I simply am. I am the hunger beneath the earth, the shadow cast by faith, the price of pretending that darkness can be held at bay with prayer and iron crosses." Margaret Brennan pushed through the crowd, her daughter Sarah clinging to her side. Both bore fresh scars where symbols had been carved into their flesh by invisible hands. "You promised to leave us alone if we stopped going to church. We did what you asked. Why won't you release us?" "Because you misunderstood the bargain, child." The creature's voice grew softer, almost paternal. "I never promised to leave you alone. I promised to show you the truth about your faith, about the God you worship, about the real source of power in this place." It gestured toward the oak tree, and the symbols on its bark flared brighter. "This tree was ancient when your Germanic ancestors arrived, old when the first humans walked these lands. It has watched civilizations rise and fall, has fed on the blood and bones of 1,000 generations. The entity you call evil, the presence you fear, it isn't some foreign invader. It's the natural order, the way things have always been." Sheriff Murdoch raised his shotgun, though his hands shook with exhaustion and fear. He hadn't slept in 4 days, surviving on coffee and determination alone. "Where's the real Pastor Kendrick?" The creature's smile widened. "Oh, but Sheriff, I am the real Pastor Kendrick. Let me show you." The air around the oak tree began to shimmer and distort, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The space beneath the massive trunk seemed to fold in on itself, revealing a cavity that extended far deeper into the earth than should have been possible. And there, suspended in the roots like flies in amber, were the bodies. Dozens of them, preserved perfectly by some unholy process, their faces frozen in expressions of terminal agony. Some wore the clothing of colonial settlers, others the garb of more recent decades. At the center of the horrific display, still wearing his black clerical collar, was Pastor Thaddeus Kendrick. But he was alive. His eyes tracked movement, his mouth opened and closed in silent screams, and his hands clawed weakly at the woody tendrils that held him in place. Around his body, the roots pulsed with a sickly luminescence, feeding on his life force while keeping him conscious to experience every moment of his slow consumption. "He volunteered, you know," the creature said. Conversationally, when I first approached him 3 weeks ago, when I explained what was coming, he offered himself willingly. Such noble sacrifice, such Christian virtue. He believed that his death would satisfy my hunger and spare his congregation. Eleanor Whitmore began to weep, her sobs echoing across the empty square. "Let him go, please, just let him go." But that would defeat the purpose, wouldn't it? The creature gestured toward the trapped bodies. Each of these souls tried the same bargain, their life for the lives of others. But individual sacrifice can only sustain me for so long. What I truly require, what I have always required, is the complete destruction of faith itself. Dr. Voss stepped forward, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was witnessing. "That's why you made the children have nightmares. Why you sent the letters. You wanted to turn the congregation against the church." Clever woman. Faith is a powerful force, you see. When concentrated and focused through genuine belief, it creates barriers that even something as old as I am cannot easily cross. But when that faith is corrupted, when doubt and fear replace devotion, those barriers crumble like sandcastles before the tide. The creature raised one clawed hand, and the 17 members of the congregation found themselves unable to move, frozen in place by an invisible force. "And now, my dear faithful servants, you have a choice to make. Join your pastor in feeding the roots, and I will grant you the mercy of madness. Your consciousness will fade as the tree consumes you, and you will dream pleasant dreams of heavenly reunion." Its black eyes swept across the terrified faces. "Or resist. Cling to your faith and experience every moment of the centuries it will take me to slowly drain your souls. The choice, as always, is yours." But Sheriff Murdoch had not come unprepared. During his research into the town's history, he'd discovered one crucial detail that Professor Blackwood had buried in a footnote of his historical account. The entity beneath the oak was not truly immortal. It was sustained by the tree itself, drawing power from the network of roots that extended beneath the entire town. And trees, no matter how ancient or evil, could burn. With his last moment of freedom before the creature's paralysis took full effect, Murdoch pulled the pin from a hand grenade he'd borrowed from his old army unit and hurled it at the base of the oak tree. The explosion shattered the night, sending chunks of bark and wood flying in all directions. The creature wearing Pastor Kendrick's face let out a shriek that shattered every window in the town square, its form beginning to waver and distort as the tree's trunk split open like a wound. "You fool," it howled, its multiple voices combining into a sound like a hurricane made of screams. "You don't understand what you have done. The tree doesn't just contain me, it contains all of them. Every creature, every entity, every nightmare that has ever been buried in this ground." The paralysis broke as the creature's concentration shattered. Murdoch's shotgun boomed twice, the blessed shells passing harmlessly through the entity's shifting form, but striking the tree's trunk with devastating effect. Sacred Heart's remaining congregation members scattered, but not before Dr. Voss managed to reach the cavity beneath the tree and begin pulling the still-living Pastor Kendrick from the mass of feeding roots. As the ancient oak burned, the ground beneath Millbrook Falls began to buckle and shift. Cracks appeared in the earth, spreading outward from the town square like a spider web of destruction. From these fissures came sounds that no human throat could produce, the voices of things that had been imprisoned beneath the earth for millennia, now freed by the tree's destruction. But the creature that had taken Pastor Kendrick's form wasn't finished. As its connection to the oak weakened, it grew more solid, more real, until it stood before them in a form that was finally terrifyingly its own. 20 feet tall, with skin like charred bark and eyes like burning coals, it towered over the fleeing townspeople with arms that ended in roots instead of hands. Its mouth opened to reveal rows of teeth made from fossilized bone, and when it spoke, the very air around it began to decay. "If I cannot feed on your faith," it roared, "then I will feast on your flesh." The battle that followed would be remembered by the survivors as something between a nightmare and a fever dream. The creature pursued them through the burning town, its massive form crushing buildings and vehicles as the freed horrors from beneath the earth swarmed through the streets. But the congregation of Sacred Heart Presbyterian, led by Sheriff Murdoch and Dr. Voss, fought back with a combination of firearms, blessed implements, and desperate courage. The turning point came when Eleanor Whitmore, the elderly church secretary who had served Sacred Heart for over 20 years, approached the creature with nothing but a worn leather Bible in her hands. "I know what you are," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the chaos. "You are not evil incarnate. You are not some ancient demon. You are just hungry, and you have been alone for so long that you have forgotten what it means to be anything else." The creature paused in its rampage, its burning eyes focusing on the small, frail woman who stood before it without fear. "For over 2 centuries you have fed on the fear and faith of this town," Eleanor continued. "But what if we offered you something different? What if we offered you peace?" She opened her Bible to the 23rd Psalm and began to read, her voice growing stronger with each word. One by one, the surviving members of the congregation joined her, their voices combining in a sound that was pure and clean and utterly human. The creature began to weaken, its massive form shrinking as the words of comfort and faith washed over it. For the first time in centuries, it was hearing something other than screams and pleas for mercy. It was hearing forgiveness. As dawn broke over the ruins of Millbrook Falls, the creature that had terrorized the town for so long simply sat down beside the burning remains of the oak tree and closed its eyes. The lesser horrors that had emerged from the earth retreated back into their underground lairs, no longer sustained by their master's hunger. Pastor Thaddeus Kendrick survived, though he would spend the rest of his life in the Pennsylvania State Hospital, mumbling prayers in languages that predated human civilization. Helena Voss documented everything she had witnessed, though her report was buried by state authorities who deemed it incompatible with public safety. Sheriff Clayton Murdoch remained in Millbrook Falls, overseeing the town's slow recovery. The oak tree was gone, reduced to ash and scattered by the wind. But something had changed in the town's character. The darkness that had lurked beneath the surface for over 2 centuries was finally gone, replaced by something that might have been hope. 17 families had survived Halloween night, 1977. They rebuilt their church, they buried their dead, and they never spoke publicly about what they had witnessed. But every year on October 31st, they gathered at the site where the oak tree had stood and read the 23rd Psalm, just to make sure the peace they had offered was still being honored. October 2. The backhoe operator's name was Jimmy Kowalski, nephew of the state police detective who had worked Pastor Kendrick's disappearance 25 years earlier. He was preparing the foundation for a new town library when his machine's bucket struck something that shouldn't have been there. "Hey, Mr. Murdoch," he called out to the elderly man who stood watching from the sidewalk. "You better come take a look at this." Clayton Murdoch, now 73, and serving his 6th term as sheriff, approached the excavation site with the careful steps of a man who had seen too much in his lifetime. In the bucket of the backhoe, surrounded by rich black earth, was a metal box about the size of a coffin. They opened it carefully, with half the town watching from a respectful distance. Inside, perfectly preserved by some unknown process, were dozens of leather-bound journals and a collection of artifacts that belonged in a museum of the occult: carved bones, metallic symbols, and what appeared to be a map of underground tunnels that extended beneath the entire Susquehanna River Valley. But it was the journals that told the real story. Written in multiple hands spanning over 2 centuries, they documented the secret history of Millbrook Falls and dozens of other communities throughout Pennsylvania. The entity beneath the oak tree hadn't been unique, it had been part of a network, a collection of ancient horrors that had colonized the region long before European settlement. The final journal, written in Pastor Kendrick's distinctive handwriting during his captivity, contained a revelation that changed everything the survivors thought they knew about their ordeal. October 30th, 1977. I understand now why it chose me, why it needed a pastor specifically. Faith isn't just a barrier against darkness, it's a conductor. The stronger the faith, the more power can flow through it. The creature never wanted to destroy our faith. It wanted to corrupt it, to turn our devotion into a channel for something far worse than itself. The oak tree was never a prison. It was a seal, and we were the key. Every prayer we offered, every Sunday service we conducted, every moment of genuine belief, it all fed into the seal, keeping something buried that makes our captor look like a saint by comparison. They are going to try to rescue me. I can feel Sheriff Murdoch making his plans, gathering the congregation for a final confrontation. But they don't understand. If they destroy the tree, if they break the seal, God forgive me, but I pray they fail. Whatever happens to me, whatever price I have to pay, it's nothing compared to what will be released if that seal is broken. The creature lied about many things, but it told the truth about one. There are worse things than darkness. There are things that make darkness look like light. The journal ended there, but attached to the final page was a map marking dozens of locations throughout Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio, all places where similar seals existed, all places where faithful congregations unknowingly stood guard over horrors beyond imagination. And according to Pastor Kendrick's research, every single one of those seals was weakening. Sheriff Murdoch closed the journal with trembling hands and looked up at the crowd of townspeople who had gathered around the excavation site. They were expecting answers, explanations, perhaps even reassurance that their ordeal had meant something. Instead, he ordered the box reburied, and the construction halted indefinitely. Some secrets, he had learned, were meant to stay buried. But late at night, when the wind howled through the streets of Millbrook Falls and the shadows seemed to move with minds of their own, Sheriff Clayton Murdoch would sometimes stand at his office window and stare at the empty lot where the oak tree had once stood. And he would wonder if, in trying to save their town, they had doomed the world. The pastor had disappeared in 1977, and what they found under the tree in 2002 had indeed changed everything. But perhaps some changes, Sheriff Murdoch reflected as he watched the shadows dance, were never meant to be reversals. Perhaps some victories were actually defeats in disguise. And perhaps the real horror wasn't what they had faced on that Halloween night 25 years ago, but what was still to come. In the distance, barely audible over the wind, came the sound of something stirring deep beneath the earth, something vast and patient and hungry, finally beginning to wake after centuries of slumber. The seal was broken. The faithful were scattered, and in towns across 3 states, ancient evils that made the creature beneath the oak tree look like a minor inconvenience were starting to stretch their metaphysical muscles and prepare for their long-awaited return to the surface world. Sheriff Clayton Murdoch pulled the curtains closed and poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon. Tomorrow he would begin making phone calls to the other communities marked on Pastor Kendrick's map. He would try to warn them, try to prepare them for what was coming. But tonight he would drink, and remember, and pray to a God who had allowed good people to suffer for reasons that still made no sense. The shepherd had been found, but the flock was more lost than ever. And somewhere in the darkness, Something that had been waiting since before the dawn of human civilization was finally, terrifyingly free.